For 42 years, Harold Blackwood and I built what everyone called the perfect marriage, starting with nothing but his charm and my family's modest nest egg from our small farm in Willowbrook County. I watched him transform from a struggling insurance salesman working out of our kitchen table to the respected CEO of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, one of the most successful investment firms in all of Rosehaven City. Through 4 decades of marriage, I supported him through sleepless nights when he was chasing his first big clients, held his hand during the stress of expanding into commercial real estate, and stood by his side through countless business dinners, where I played the perfect supportive wife while he networked with the city's elite. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was Margaret Blackwood, and at 71 years old, I had spent more than half my life ensuring Harold's dreams became reality. When we first met at that church social in 1982, I was 29, a schoolteacher with a master's degree in business administration that I'd earned on weekends while working full-time. Harold was 32, handsome and ambitious, with big plans and bigger dreams. He swept me off my feet with talks of building an empire together, of creating something lasting that we could pass down to our children. But somewhere along the way, we became he, and our dreams became his vision. I gave up my teaching career when Harold said the business needed my full attention at home. "Margaret, darling," he'd say, "I need you managing our household like the CEO you could have been. This is just as important as any boardroom." I believed him. I managed our finances, handled his schedule, entertained his clients' wives, and raised our 3 children, Elizabeth, Thomas, and little Sarah, while he traveled the state building what would become Pinnacle Financial Holdings. The early years were genuinely wonderful. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, counting every penny, planning our future over coffee and homemade pie. When Elizabeth was born, we celebrated with sparkling cider instead of champagne because we were saving every dollar for Harold's business license and first office lease. Harold would hold my hand during those long evenings and promise, "One day, Maggie, we'll have that big house on Rosewood Hill, and you'll never have to worry about money again." By our 20th anniversary, Harold had founded Pinnacle Financial Holdings, and we'd moved to that dream house on Rosewood Hill, a beautiful colonial with 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a view of Lake Serenity that took your breath away. I remember our housewarming party, how Harold proudly told everyone, "None of this would have been possible without my Margaret. She's the foundation that let me build our success." I treasured those words and hung on to them through the years that followed. But as Harold's business grew, his appreciation for my contributions seemed to shrink. The man who once valued my business insights began dismissing my opinions as cute suggestions from my housewife. When I tried to discuss investment strategies or market trends, subjects I'd actually studied formally, he'd pat my hand condescendingly and say, "Leave the business talk to me, dear. You focus on what you do best." What I did best, apparently, was becoming invisible. Harold started missing family dinners for crucial client meetings. He forgot Elizabeth's graduation because of an emergency in the capital city of Grandview. When Thomas got married, Harold spent the reception on his phone with investors who couldn't wait. Each time, he'd apologize with expensive gifts, jewelry I rarely wore, flowers I didn't particularly want, and promises that things would settle down soon. But things never settled down. Harold's world grew larger while mine grew smaller. The children moved away and started their own lives. Elizabeth became a lawyer in Grandview, visiting twice a year with obligatory gifts and polite conversation. Thomas settled in Millbrook with his wife, too busy with his own career to call more than once a month. Sarah, our youngest, moved clear, across the country to Ocean View, sending postcards and brief phone calls that felt more like duty than love. They all seemed to accept that Dad was the important one, the successful one, while Mom was just there, For years, I managed our personal investments while Harold focused on building Pinnacle. Every bonus, every windfall, I carefully invested through accounts I'd set up decades earlier with my maiden name, Margaret Ashford. Harold barely paid attention to our personal portfolio. "You handle our household money, Maggie," he'd say dismissively. "I handle the real business." He never asked about the investment meetings I attended or the financial calls I took. In his mind, my little hobby was cute, but irrelevant compared to his empire building. That's why he had no idea that over the past 6 months, I had quietly become the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, the very company he considered his greatest achievement and most valuable possession. Yesterday was our 42nd wedding anniversary. I spent the morning preparing Harold's favorite breakfast and arranging fresh roses from our garden, the same ritual I'd followed for decades. I expected perhaps a card, maybe dinner at Giuseppe's Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated so many milestones. Instead, Harold walked into our sunroom carrying a manila envelope and a bouquet of yellow carnations, flowers I'd mentioned disliking at least 100 times over the years. "Margaret," he said, not even sitting down, "I think it's time we talked about our future." He handed me the envelope with all the emotion of someone passing along junk mail. Inside were divorce papers, professionally prepared, outlining his generous settlement offer. I would keep the house, receive a monthly allowance, and get a small percentage of Pinnacle's shares, as recognition, the document stated, for her years of household support. Harold watched me scan the papers with an expression somewhere between boredom and impatience. "I've met someone, Margaret. Victoria Sterling. She's 38, brilliant, and she understands the business world in ways that match my ambitions." He adjusted his tie, the same nervous habit he'd had since our dating days. "We've both changed over the years. You've been content with your domestic life, and I need a partner who can match my professional growth." What Harold didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his most paranoid nightmares, was that I wasn't just the devoted housewife he'd spent decades taking for granted. I was now the owner of 63% of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, controlling interest in the company he'd built his entire identity around. I owned him, and he didn't have a clue. Before we dive into how I pulled off the biggest financial coup in Rosehaven City's history, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story of long overdue justice sounds like something you need to hear. Make sure you hit that subscribe button because what happens next will shock you even more than it shocked Harold. This is my story. This is how a 71-year-old housewife brought down the man who thought he could discard 4 decades of marriage like yesterday's newspaper, and Harold Blackwood never saw it coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm Margaret Ashford Blackwood, though for most of the past 4 decades, I've simply been known as Harold's wife. At 71, I've lived long enough to understand that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are often very different from the truth others see, and sometimes completely different from what actually happened. When I met Harold at the Willowbrook County Church Social in the fall of 1982, I was 29 years old and absolutely not looking for a husband. I had just completed my master's in business administration through the weekend program at Grandview University, a grueling 3-year journey that I'd managed while teaching 5th grade full-time at Willowbrook Elementary. My weekends were spent in lecture halls and libraries instead of at the social events most women my age attended, but I had plans. Big plans. I wanted to open my own financial consulting firm, specializing in helping working families build wealth through practical investment strategies. It was an unusual dream for a woman in 1982, but I had the education, the drive, and a small inheritance from my grandmother's farm that would serve as seed money. I was independent, focused, and frankly, I thought I was too busy for romance. Harold, Blackwood changed all of that in the span of a single evening. He was 32, tall and confident, with sandy brown hair and blue eyes that seemed to light up when he talked about his dreams. Harold worked as an insurance salesman for Reliable Life Insurance, but that was just temporary, he assured me. He had visions of starting his own investment firm, of helping people build financial security, of creating something lasting and meaningful. When he talked about his plans, his whole face animated with passion and ambition. "Margaret," he said during our first real conversation over punch and church cookies, "I can see you understand business. Most people think insurance is boring, but you get it. It's about protecting people's futures, about building something solid they can count on." He was right. I did understand. And more than that, I was impressed by his vision. Here was a man who saw the same opportunities I did, who wanted to build something meaningful in the financial world. When he asked me to dinner the following week, I said yes, not just because I was attracted to him, but because I was genuinely excited to meet someone who shared my professional interests. Our courtship was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Harold didn't just want to take me to movies and restaurants. He wanted to talk business strategy, to share his plans for the future, to hear my thoughts on market trends and investment opportunities. He was fascinated by my MBA coursework and constantly asked for my insights on financial planning techniques I was learning. "You're brilliant, Margaret," he'd tell me as we walked around Lake Serenity in the evenings. "With your education and my sales experience, we could build something incredible together, a real partnership." 6 months after we met, Harold proposed, not with a traditional romantic speech, but with a business plan, literally. He presented me with a detailed proposal for Blackwood Financial Services, a company we would build together, using my inheritance as startup capital and my business knowledge combined with his client relationship skills. "Marry me, Margaret," he said, down on one knee in my tiny apartment on Elm Street, "and let's build an empire together." I said yes to both the marriage and the business partnership. We were wed at Willowbrook Methodist Church in June of 1983, and I've never forgotten Harold's words during our ceremony. In his vows, he promised to be not just my husband, but my partner in every sense of the word. "What we build," he said, looking directly into my eyes, "we build together, as equals." The first 5 years of our marriage were exactly what Harold had promised, a true partnership. We started Blackwood Financial Services, which would later become Pinnacle Financial Holdings, with $35,000 from my grandmother's estate and a shared dream of helping families in Rosehaven City build financial security. Harold handled client acquisition and sales, while I managed the technical aspects, investment research, portfolio development, and financial planning strategies. We worked out of our kitchen table in our little starter home on Pine Avenue, taking turns making coffee and sharing a single telephone line. Harold would spend his days meeting potential clients at Giuseppe's Cafe or the Rosehaven Country Club, charming them with his natural charisma and genuine enthusiasm for financial planning. Then he'd come home and we'd work together late into the evening, developing customized investment strategies for each new client. I loved those early years. Harold genuinely valued my input and expertise. When Mrs. Henderson, the widow of Rosehaven's former mayor, came to us with a complex estate planning challenge, Harold immediately turned to me. "Margaret's the strategist," he'd tell clients proudly. "I bring them in, but she's the one who figures out how to make their money work for them." We celebrated every milestone together. Our first $100,000 in managed assets. Our first year with 6-figure revenue. The day we could afford to rent a real office space in downtown Rosehaven's historic district. Harold insisted that my name be on all the business documents as co-founder and equal partner. When Elizabeth was born in 1987, we decided I would step back from day-to-day client meetings to focus on the analytical work I could do from home. It seemed like a practical decision at the time. Harold was the natural salesman, and I could contribute just as effectively by managing our investment research and strategy development remotely. "This is temporary," Harold assured me as I set up a home office in our spare bedroom. Once Elizabeth is older and we've grown the business enough to hire staff, you'll come back to the main office. We're still partners in everything, Maggie. Looking back now, I can see that this was the beginning of the end of our true partnership, though it happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it at the time. The transition felt natural, even sensible. Harold had a gift for building relationships with clients, and I had a talent for the technical analysis that made their investments successful. We were playing to our strengths, or so I told myself. But what I didn't realize was that by stepping away from direct client contact, I was also stepping away from credit for our company's success. When Harold met with clients, he would present his investment strategies and his financial recommendations. My research and analysis became invisible, filtered through Harold's presentations until it seemed like the insights originated with him. The first crack in our partnership facade came during our 10th anniversary celebration in 1993. We were at a dinner party hosted by the Chambers of Commerce, celebrating local business success stories. When Harold was invited to speak about Blackwood Financial Services growth, he stood up and delivered a speech about his vision, his client relationships, and his strategic decisions. He mentioned me once, saying, "Of course, none of this would be possible without my wonderful wife Margaret, who keeps our home running smoothly so I can focus on building our business." I smiled and nodded like the supportive wife I was supposed to be. But inside, something cold settled in my chest. Our business had become his business. Our partnership had become his success with my support. And somehow, without either of us explicitly deciding it, I had become the woman behind the man instead of the equal partner I'd been promised. That night, as we drove home through the quiet streets of Rosehaven, I asked Harold about the speech. "Why didn't you mention my role in developing the investment strategies, or the fact that I handle all the portfolio analysis?" Harold reached over and patted my hand, the same gesture that would become maddeningly familiar over the years that followed. "Darling, you know how much I value everything you do, but clients want to feel confident in their advisor, and they expect that advisor to be the face of the company. Your contributions are crucial, but they're behind-the-scenes crucial." I accepted that explanation because I wanted to believe it. Because Harold was my husband and my partner, and partners trust each other. Because I loved him and thought he loved me the same way. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was absolutely right about one thing. I did have a talent for long-term strategic thinking. Harold just had no idea how long-term my thinking had become, or how strategic my recent decisions had been. The foundation of our marriage and our business had been built on a promise of partnership. Over the next 3 decades, Harold would systematically break that promise while I quietly prepared for the day when I'd remind him what a real partnership looked like. That day had finally arrived. What followed that Chamber of Commerce dinner was 29 years of slow, methodical erasure. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the insidious, gradual disappearance of a person's contributions, value, and ultimately, their very identity within their own marriage. Harold didn't wake up one morning and decide to marginalize me. It happened through 1,000 small moments, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but together forming a pattern that would reshape our entire relationship dynamic. Like watching your hair turn gray, you don't notice it happening day by day, but one morning you look in the mirror and wonder when you became invisible. The first major sacrifice came in 1995 when Thomas was born and Elizabeth was 8. Harold had been invited to join the prestigious Rosehaven Business Council, a networking organization that met monthly at the exclusive Grandview Country Club. The meetings were scheduled for the same evenings I had been attending continuing education, seminars to maintain my financial advisor certification. "Margaret, darling," Harold said, straightening his tie before another council dinner. "I think it might be time for you to step back from those certification courses. The children need stability, and frankly, with the business growing so rapidly. I need you here managing the home front. You can always pick up those credentials later when things settle down, I wanted to argue. Those certifications weren't just pieces of paper. They were my professional lifeline, my connection to the industry knowledge that had made our early success possible. But Harold made it sound so reasonable, so temporary. And I did want what was best for our children and our growing business. So I stepped back, again. Harold promised it was temporary. Just until we get through this growth phase, he assured me. Maybe 2 or 3 years, and then you can jump back into the professional development. Those 2 or 3 years stretched into a decade, then 2 decades, then 3. Every time I mentioned returning to active certification or rejoining professional organizations, Harold had another reason why the timing wasn't right. The business was expanding into commercial real estate. We were opening a second location in Millbrook. He was considering a run for the Rosehaven City Council. Elizabeth was applying to colleges and needed my help with applications. Always something. Always soon. Always later. By the time Sarah was born in 1998, I had completely stepped away from any professional identity outside of Harold's wife and the children's mother. Harold had hired a team of certified financial advisors to handle the analytical work I used to do, though he still occasionally asked for my input on complex cases. But even that became filtered through his interpretation. Margaret has some interesting thoughts on portfolio diversification, he'd tell his staff, as if I were an enthusiastic amateur rather than the woman who had co-founded the company and held an MBA in finance. The promises about returning to active partnership became increasingly vague. Once the children are all in school full-time. Then, once they're in high school and more independent. Finally, once they're launched into their own careers. But by the time our children were adults, I had been out of the active business world for so long that Harold, and eventually even I, began to believe his version of our history. The version where he was the visionary entrepreneur, and I was the supportive family foundation that had enabled his success. Harold's success became more public and more celebrated throughout the 2000s. Pinnacle Financial Holdings expanded to manage over $500 million in assets. Harold was featured on the cover of Rosehaven Business Monthly 3 times. He was invited to speak at conferences in the state capitol and even once in Chicago. The mayor appointed him to the Economic Development Council. With each accolade, each new level of recognition, Harold grew more confident in his narrative of self-made success. He began introducing me at business functions as my wife Margaret, who's been such tremendous support throughout my career. Not my business partner or my co-founder, but my support. The children absorbed this narrative completely. Elizabeth, brilliant and ambitious, clearly idolized her successful father while viewing me as the traditional mother who had chosen domestic life over career ambitions. During her college years, she'd bring friends home and introduce Harold as my dad who built Pinnacle Financial from nothing, while I was simply my mom who's been amazing at taking care of our family. Thomas followed his father's lead in viewing business success as the measure of personal worth. He'd call Harold for advice about investments and career decisions, while our conversations centered around family news and local gossip. Sarah, our youngest, seemed to view me with mild pity, as if I were a relic from an era when women settled for less than they deserved. None of them knew that I had continued managing our personal investment portfolio throughout all these years. Harold had been so focused on building his public business success that he'd completely delegated our private financial affairs to me. "You handle our household money, Maggie," became his standard response to any questions about our personal investments. "I don't have time to micromanage our domestic finances." What Harold didn't realize was that our domestic finances had grown to substantial proportions. I had invested my original inheritance wisely, reinvested the returns, and gradually built a portfolio worth millions. I attended investment seminars under my maiden name, Margaret Ashford, I subscribed to financial publications. I maintained relationships with investment advisors and portfolio managers throughout the region. Harold assumed my occasional investment meetings were social activities or charity planning sessions. When I'd return from a day in Grandview meeting, with financial advisors, he'd ask, "How was your ladies' lunch?" without listening to the answer. The most painful sacrifice wasn't professional, it was personal. Harold's growing success brought growing demands on his time and attention, but it also brought growing temptations. The first affair I discovered was in 2003, when Harold was 54 and I was 50. I found hotel receipts and credit card charges that didn't match his claimed business travel schedule. When I confronted him, Harold was genuinely apologetic. "Margaret, it was a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment. You know how much pressure I'm under, how isolated I feel sometimes when I'm traveling. It meant nothing. You and the children are everything to me." I forgave him because that's what good wives did, because I believed marriages were worth fighting for, because I thought the man I'd fallen in love with was still there underneath the successful businessman persona he'd developed. The second affair happened in 2007. This time, Harold's explanation focused on how we'd grown apart, how the demands of his career had created distance between us that he didn't know how to bridge. "Maybe we should consider counseling," he suggested. "Figure out how to reconnect." We tried counseling for 6 months. Harold attended every session and said all the right things about commitment and communication, but the underlying problem was never addressed. Harold had grown to see me as a supporting character in his life story, rather than the co-author I'd once been. The third affair was in 2011. I stopped confronting him after that. What was the point? Harold would apologize. We'd have a few months of renewed attention from him, and then the pattern would repeat. I realized that Harold wasn't having affairs because our marriage was lacking something essential. He was having affairs because he could. Because his success had convinced him that he deserved whatever he wanted, and I had trained him to believe that I would always forgive, always understand, always be there. That's when I stopped forgiving and started planning. Harold continued to make promises about our future. Once I stepped back from day-to-day operations, he'd say, "We'll travel together, spend more time together, maybe even work on some projects together." But Harold never stepped back. His success was too intoxicating, his public recognition too satisfying. Meanwhile, I attended every business function as the supportive wife, smiled through every introduction as Harold's better half, and listened to countless speeches where Harold credited his success to his wonderful family support system without ever mentioning my actual contributions to building Pinnacle Financial. The children grew up and moved away, creating their own lives and their own versions of our family story. Elizabeth became a successful corporate lawyer who rarely called unless she needed something. Thomas built his own business and seemed to view family obligations as inconveniences to be managed efficiently. Sarah moved across the country and stayed there, sending birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but maintaining careful emotional distance. I had given Harold 42 years of my life, my business expertise, my professional ambitions, and my unconditional support. I had raised his children, managed his household, maintained his social connections, and preserved his reputation through multiple infidelities. I had been the perfect wife by every traditional measure, and Harold repaid me by deciding I was no longer necessary for the next chapter of his story. But what Harold didn't understand was that while he'd been taking my contributions for granted, I'd been taking notes. While he'd been building his public success, I'd been building something much more private and much more powerful. Harold thought he could write me out of his story with divorce papers and a settlement offer. He was about to learn that I'd been writing my own story all along, and his role in it was about to change dramatically. The transformation from forgiving wife to strategic planner didn't happen overnight. It began in 2012, the year after Harold's third confirmed affair, when I finally accepted that our marriage wasn't going through rough patches. It was fundamentally broken, and Harold had no intention of fixing it. That's when I started what I privately called Project Clarity, my systematic preparation for an uncertain future. Harold assumed I was planning charity events and book club meetings. In reality, I was conducting graduate-level research into corporate structure, investment law, and strategic acquisition. My first step was reconnecting with my professional network, or what remained of it after 20 years of social isolation. I reached out through my original contacts from Grandview University's MBA program, many of whom had gone on to significant careers in finance and business law. I framed these reconnections as exploring volunteer opportunities for financially literate retirees, which wasn't entirely untrue. I was volunteering my skills, just not in the way people assumed. Dr. Rebecca Chen, my former corporate finance professor, had become a partner at Sterling and Associates, one of the state's most respected investment advisory firms. When I contacted her about staying intellectually engaged in financial markets, she invited me to lunch at the Grandview Metropolitan Club. Margaret Ashford, she said, using my maiden name as I'd requested. I always wondered what happened to one of my brightest students. Harold Blackwood is your husband, isn't he? I've followed Pinnacle's success in the business journals. Over lunch, I carefully explained that I was interested in keeping my financial skills sharp through personal investment projects, separate from Harold's business activities. Dr. Chen was intrigued by my interest in complex portfolio management and offered to connect me with some of her most sophisticated clients who might appreciate additional strategic consulting. That lunch led to a series of discreet consulting arrangements. I began advising wealthy families on long-term investment strategies, working under my maiden name to avoid any association with Pinnacle Financial. My clients appreciated my thorough research methodology and my ability to identify undervalued opportunities that larger firms overlooked. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing exactly the same work that had made Pinnacle successful in its early years. But now I was being paid directly for my expertise instead of watching Harold take credit for it. Within 2 years, my consulting income had grown to 6 figures annually. More importantly, I had rebuilt my professional credibility and expanded my network throughout the regional financial community. I was Margaret Ashford again, not just Harold's wife. But rebuilding my professional identity was only the first phase of Project Clarity. The second phase was far more ambitious, understanding exactly how Harold had structured Pinnacle Financial Holdings and identifying potential vulnerabilities in that structure. This required delicate research. I couldn't directly access Pinnacle's internal documents, but I could access public filings, industry reports, and information shared by Harold himself during his increasingly rare moments of treating me as a confidant rather than an accessory. Harold had always been proud of Pinnacle's growth and loved discussing business strategy during the occasional evenings when he was home and in good spirits. He viewed these conversations as harmless shop talk with his supportive wife. I viewed them as intelligence gathering. We're considering a major expansion into wealth management for ultra-high net worth clients, he told me over dinner in early 2014. The profit margins are incredible, but it requires significant capital investment in new systems and staff. That sounds exciting, I replied, refilling his wine glass. How are you planning to finance that kind of expansion? Harold launched into a detailed explanation of his financing strategy, including his plans to issue new shares to attract outside investors. He was particularly excited about interest from Meridian Capital Group, a private equity firm based in the state capital. What Harold didn't realize was that I was taking mental notes of every detail. Later that evening, while he watched television, I researched Meridian Capital Group extensively. By the end of the week, I had contacted their managing partner, David Richardson, to discuss potential investment opportunities for my family trust. This became my pattern. Harold would share business information, assuming I was just being a good listener, and I would research every detail to understand how it fit into Pinnacle's larger strategic picture. The third phase of Project Clarity was the most complex, building my own investment position that could potentially influence Pinnacle's future direction. This required careful planning, substantial capital, and perfect timing. I had been managing our personal investments for decades, turning Harold's bonuses and my consulting income into a diversified portfolio worth approximately $3.2 million. By 2015, Harold knew our personal wealth had grown substantially, but he assumed it was simply the result of his generous bonuses and wise asset allocation. He never asked for details about specific investments or portfolio structure. That lack of curiosity became my greatest advantage. I began restructuring our personal holdings to create maximum flexibility for future strategic moves. Instead of traditional mutual funds and individual stocks, I shifted toward more sophisticated investment vehicles, private equity partnerships, hedge fund investments, and direct participation in business acquisitions. The most significant move came in late 2015 when Meridian Capital Group announced they were raising a new fund specifically focused on acquiring and consolidating regional financial services firms. Harold was thrilled. This was exactly the type of sophisticated investor he wanted to attract to Pinnacle. What Harold didn't know was that I had already committed $800,000 to Meridian's new fund as a limited partner, giving me inside access to their acquisition strategy and their specific interest in firms like Pinnacle. Through my position in the Meridian Fund, I learned that they viewed Pinnacle as an ideal acquisition target, successful but undercapitalized, led by a charismatic but aging founder who might be ready to cash out, and operating in markets with significant growth potential. They were planning to approach Harold within the next 2 years with a buyout offer. This intelligence allowed me to position myself perfectly for what I knew was coming. If Harold was going to sell Pinnacle, I wanted to be on both sides of that transaction. The fourth phase of Project Clarity was the most audacious, gradually acquiring shares in Pinnacle Financial Holdings itself. This required extreme discretion, since Harold would immediately notice if I started purchasing company stock directly. Instead, I worked through a network of investment vehicles I had established over several years. My consulting clients included several family trusts and small foundations that were looking for stable, long-term investments. I recommended Pinnacle Financial Holdings to these clients, offering to help them acquire shares through private transactions with existing shareholders. Harold was delighted when I mentioned that some of my charity contacts were interested in investing in Pinnacle. "That's wonderful, Margaret," he said, not bothering to ask for specifics. "Word-of-mouth referrals from respected community members are exactly the kind of investors we want." He had no idea that I was coordinating these investments, structuring them to give me indirect influence over the shares, and gradually building a coalition of investors who would follow my recommendations on corporate governance issues. By 2017, I controlled approximately 15% of Pinnacle's outstanding shares through various trusts and partnerships. Harold knew that community investors owned a significant minority stake in the company, but he didn't realize that those investors all took their guidance from the same source: his wife. The fifth and final phase of Project Clarity was the most patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal my position. I knew that moment would come when Harold's personal behavior created a vulnerability that I could exploit. I didn't have to wait long. Harold's relationship with Victoria Sterling began. In early 2018, though he thought he was being discreet about it. Victoria was 38, recently divorced, and working as a marketing director for a client firm that did significant business with Pinnacle. Harold started mentioning her frequently in casual conversation, praising her business acumen and strategic thinking. "Victoria has some fascinating insights about digital marketing for financial services," he'd tell me over dinner. "She really understands how to reach younger clients in ways that our traditional approaches don't." I smiled and nodded, just as I had during his previous affairs. But this time, I was also researching Victoria Sterling, her professional background, her financial situation, and her connection to Harold's business network. What I discovered was that Victoria wasn't just another affair partner. She was positioning herself as Harold's potential business partner, offering to help him modernize Pinnacle's client acquisition strategies and expand into new markets. Harold was clearly smitten not just with Victoria personally, but with her professional capabilities. For the first time in decades, Harold was considering bringing someone else into the strategic leadership of Pinnacle Financial Holdings. Someone who wasn't his wife. That's when I realized that my 20-year preparation period was about to pay off in ways I had never fully anticipated. Harold wasn't just planning to replace me personally, he was planning to replace me professionally with a woman 33 years younger who had convinced him she could help take Pinnacle to the next level. Harold thought he was planning his next chapter with Victoria. What he didn't realize was that I had already written the ending to his story, and Victoria Sterling was about to become a minor character in my much larger narrative. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be unforgettable. The moment that transformed 6 years of careful preparation into decisive action came on a Tuesday morning in September 2018, when I discovered Harold's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, calculated, and designed to erase me from the very company I had helped create. I had driven to our lake house at Serenity Shores for what I thought would be a peaceful day of reading and planning the details for our upcoming 35th anniversary celebration. Harold had told me he was spending the week in the state capitol meeting with potential investors for Pinnacle's expansion, and I was looking forward to some quiet time to organize the dinner party I was planning for October. Our lake house had been Harold's 50th birthday gift to himself 5 years earlier, a beautiful cedar and stone retreat overlooking the north shore of Lake Serenity, about 40 minutes from Rosehaven. It was supposed to be our peaceful escape from the pressures of business and social obligations, a place where we could reconnect as a couple and remember why we had fallen in love. Instead, it had become Harold's private sanctuary, a place he retreated to for strategic planning sessions and quiet reflection on business challenges. I visited rarely, mainly to oversee seasonal maintenance and ensure the house was ready for the few times Harold actually invited me to join him there. That Tuesday, I had planned to spend the day organizing our anniversary guest list and finalizing the menu with our caterer over the phone. Harold wasn't expecting me. I had mentioned the possibility of visiting the lake house, but hadn't confirmed definite plans. As I turned into our private driveway, I noticed a second car parked beside Harold's BMW, a silver Lexus with vanity plates reading Victor 1, Victoria Sterling's car. My first instinct was confusion rather than anger. Victoria was supposedly a client contact, and while I knew Harold had been working closely with her on marketing strategies, I couldn't understand why they would be meeting at our private retreat, rather than at Pinnacle's offices. I parked quietly and walked toward the house, intending to simply knock and say hello. Through the large picture windows that faced the lake, I could see into our main living area, where Harold and Victoria were sitting together on the leather sofa, papers spread across the coffee table, deep in what appeared to be an intense business discussion. Nothing about the scene suggested romance or impropriety. They were dressed professionally, sitting at appropriate distances, focused on documents and laptops. If I had interrupted them at that moment, Harold would have had a perfectly reasonable explanation about bringing Victoria somewhere quiet to focus on important strategic planning. But something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was years of having my instincts dismissed as paranoia, or perhaps it was the hard-earned wisdom that comes from discovering 3 previous affairs. Instead of announcing my presence, I walked around to the side of the house where I could hear their conversation through the slightly open window. What I heard wasn't personal betrayal. It was something far worse. The transition needs to happen. Gradually, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the autumn air. If we move too quickly to formalize my role as Chief Strategy Officer, it might raise questions about the company's direction and stability. Harold's response made my blood run cold. I agree. Margaret's been completely disconnected from the business for decades, so there shouldn't be any real complications from that angle. She's never even asked to see financial statements or board meeting minutes. But she is still technically listed as co-founder on the original incorporation documents, Victoria replied. My attorney says that could potentially create issues down the road, especially if you decide to take the company public or pursue a major acquisition. There was a pause, and I heard papers rustling. That's easily handled, Harold said dismissively. Those documents are from 1983. Margaret made some initial contributions during our startup phase, but she hasn't been operationally involved in decades. Any lawyer worth their fee can demonstrate that her co-founder status was ceremonial rather than substantive. Victoria laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both musical and calculating. Ceremonial. I like that. Like being the Queen of England. Lots of fancy titles, but no real power. Exactly, Harold agreed, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Margaret's been content playing the role of supportive wife. She's never expressed interest in active business involvement. Hell, she doesn't even understand most of what we do anymore. The financial services industry has evolved far beyond her old MBA coursework. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough to understand what was happening. Harold wasn't just planning to divorce me and start fresh with Victoria. He was planning to rewrite the history of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, removing me entirely from the narrative of the company's creation and success, and positioning Victoria as his new business partner. They were discussing strategies for transitioning client relationships to reflect the new leadership structure, which apparently meant gradually introducing Victoria as Harold's strategic partner while phasing out any mention of my historical role in the company. Victoria had prepared a detailed presentation about modernizing Pinnacle's founding story to better align with current market positioning. In other words, they were planning to erase me completely. The conversation shifted to more personal territory as Victoria outlined her vision for Harold's future. She spoke about their plans to relocate Pinnacle's headquarters to a more prestigious location in the state capital, where they could attract higher-profile clients and establish Harold as a regional industry leader. She had already identified office space and begun preliminary discussions with potential staff. Margaret will be comfortable in Rosehaven, Harold said, as if my contentment with small-town life was a given rather than a choice. She's never been interested in the kind of sophisticated business environment we're planning to create. This transition will actually be better for everyone. Victoria's response revealed the depth of their planning and the calculated nature of their betrayal. I've already spoken with several of our key clients about the leadership transition. Most of them don't even realize Margaret was ever involved in the business beyond social functions. The narrative that you built Pinnacle single-handedly is already well established in the market. They spent another hour discussing details that made it clear this wasn't a recent development. Victoria had been positioning herself as Harold's business successor for months, possibly years. She had cultivated relationships with major clients, developed strategic plans for company expansion, and even begun discussions with potential investors, all while Harold systematically excluded me from any knowledge of these developments. The most devastating revelation came near the end of their meeting, when Victoria mentioned her concerns about the upcoming anniversary celebration I was planning. "Are you sure it's wise to have such a public celebration of your marriage right now?" she asked. "If we're planning to announce our partnership officially after the first of the year, it might send mixed messages to clients and community leaders." Harold's response was the moment I realized our marriage wasn't just ending. It had already ended in his mind months or possibly years earlier. "The anniversary party is Margaret's project," he said dismissively. "She's put a lot of effort into planning it, and it would be cruel to cancel at this point. Besides, it will be a good opportunity for me to publicly thank her for her years of support before we transition to the next phase of our lives." Victoria's laugh was sharper this time. "A farewell performance. How thoughtful of you." "Think of it as closure," Harold replied. "Margaret deserves recognition for her contributions as my wife, even if she was never really a business partner. After 35 years, she's earned a graceful exit. A graceful exit. After 35 years of marriage and co-founding the company that had made Harold wealthy and respected, I was being granted permission to exit gracefully while he and his protégé rewrote history to suit their future plans. I stood outside that window for several more minutes, listening to Harold and Victoria discuss the logistics of my erasure with the same casual efficiency they might use to plan a client presentation. They were methodical, thorough, and completely confident that I would accept whatever version of events they chose to present. That confidence would prove to be their greatest mistake. I walked back to my car as quietly as I had arrived, my mind already shifting from shock and hurt to something far more focused and dangerous. Harold and Victoria thought they were planning my exit from their story. What they didn't realize was that I had been writing my own story for the past 6 years, and their roles in it were about to change dramatically. As I drove back toward Rosehaven, I pulled over at the scenic overlook halfway home and made 3 phone calls. The first was to David Richardson at Meridian Capital Group, confirming our scheduled meeting for the following week. The second was to my attorney, Jonathan Webb, requesting an urgent consultation about corporate governance issues. The third was to Dr. Rebecca Chen, asking if she could recommend a private investigator who specialized in corporate intelligence. Harold thought he was orchestrating my graceful exit. Instead, he had just triggered the final phase of Project Clarity. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was about to begin. The anniversary party Harold was so generously allowing me to host would indeed be a farewell performance. Just not the kind he was expecting. The 72 hours following my discovery at the lake house transformed 6 years of careful preparation into a precisely orchestrated campaign that would have impressed any military strategist. Harold had no idea that while he was planning my graceful exit, I was executing the most sophisticated corporate maneuver of my entire career. My first meeting was with Jonathan Webb at Webb & Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal affairs for the past 15 years. Jonathan had always known me as Harold's wife, the pleasant woman who occasionally accompanied her husband to legal consultations but rarely spoke during business discussions. That perception was about to change dramatically. Margaret, Jonathan, greeted me in his downtown Rosehaven office. Harold mentioned you might be stopping by about some personal legal matters. How can I help you today? I placed a thick folder on his mahogany desk and met his eyes directly. Jonathan, I need you to forget everything you think you know about my relationship with Pinnacle Financial Holdings, and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. For the next 2 hours, I walked Jonathan through the complete history of Pinnacle's founding, providing documentation he had never seen before. The original business plan that I had written in 1983, bank records showing my $35,000 initial investment, corporate filing documents with my signature as co-founder, financial records proving my ongoing contributions to the company's strategic development throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Jonathan's expression shifted from polite attention to genuine surprise to something approaching awe as he reviewed the documents. Margaret, I had no idea you were this involved in Pinnacle's creation, he said, setting down the original incorporation papers. Harold has always presented the company's history as his solo venture with your personal support. Harold's version of history has become increasingly convenient over the years, I replied. But legal documents don't lie, and I've kept copies of everything. I then outlined what I had overheard at the lake house, Harold's plans to formalize Victoria Sterling as his business partner, and their strategy for erasing my historical role in the company. Jonathan took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his growing understanding of the situation's complexity. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" he asked finally. "I want to exercise my rights as co-founder and original investor," I said calmly, beginning with demanding a comprehensive audit of Pinnacle's corporate governance and financial management over the past decade. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, clearly recognizing the implications. "Margaret, That kind of audit could uncover irregularities or mismanagement that might require board action or shareholder intervention. Yes, I agreed. It could. My second meeting was with David Richardson at Meridian Capital Group's offices in the state capitol. David had known me for 3 years as a sophisticated limited partner in their investment fund, but he didn't know about my connection to Pinnacle Financial Holdings, one of their primary acquisition targets. Margaret, he said, welcoming me into his glass-walled conference room overlooking the Capitol building. I'm always pleased to hear from one of our most insightful investors. What brings you to Grandview today? I understand Meridian is considering an acquisition in the regional financial services sector, I began, watching his expression carefully. David's professional smile became more guarded. We evaluate opportunities in several sectors, but I can't discuss specific targets or strategies with limited partners. Even when that limited partner might be able to provide unique insight into your primary target's actual corporate structure and governance? I let that statement hang in the air while David processed its implications. Then I placed my business card on the table. Not the social calling card I used for charity functions, but the professional card I had created for my consulting work. Margaret Ashford, Strategic Financial Consultant. I believe we need to have a different kind of conversation, I said. Over the next hour, I carefully revealed my connection to Pinnacle Financial Holdings without disclosing the personal complications of my marriage to Harold. I presented myself as a concerned co-founder who had discovered irregularities in corporate governance and was seeking guidance about shareholder options for addressing management issues. David was fascinated. Meridian had been studying Pinnacle for 2 years, but their research had focused on Harold's public leadership and the company's financial performance. They had never investigated the original corporate structure or identified potential governance vulnerabilities. If what you're suggesting is accurate, David said, reviewing the documents I provided, then Pinnacle's acquisition value might be significantly different from our current assessment. Corporate governance issues could either create opportunities for a strategic buyer or complicate any acquisition significantly. That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you, I replied. Meridian's interests and mine might be more aligned than you realize. My third crucial meeting was with Patricia Stern, the private investigator Dr. Rebecca Chen had recommended. Patricia specialized in corporate intelligence, particularly cases involving family businesses where personal and professional relationships had become complicated. We met at a discreet cafe in Millbrook, halfway between Rosehaven and the state capitol. Patricia was a former FBI financial crimes investigator who had established her own firm focusing on corporate due diligence and internal investigations. Dr. Chen gave me a brief overview of your situation, Patricia said, settling into our corner booth with a tablet and legal pad. You suspect your husband is planning to restructure his company in ways that might violate your rights as co-founder? I don't suspect it, I corrected. I know it. I overheard detailed planning sessions, and I need documentation that will stand up in legal proceedings. I outlined Harold's relationship with Victoria Sterling, their business partnership plans, and their strategy for rewriting Pinnacle's corporate history. Patricia took extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification about timelines and specific statements I had overheard. What you're describing sounds like potential corporate governance violations and possibly breach of fiduciary duty, she said. If your husband is planning to transfer company assets or restructure ownership without proper shareholder notification, there could be legal consequences. Patricia agreed to conduct a comprehensive investigation into Harold's recent business activities, Victoria Sterling's background and potential conflicts of interest, and any irregularities in Pinnacle's corporate governance over the past 2 years. How quickly do you need this information? She asked. I'm planning to take action at our anniversary party in 3 weeks, I said. I want complete documentation. By then. The fourth phase of my strategic execution involved activating the network of relationships I had built through my consulting work and investment activities. Over the past 6 years, I had developed professional connections throughout the regional financial community, connections that Harold didn't even know existed. I reached out to 5 key contacts who held significant influence in Rosehaven's business community. Each conversation was carefully crafted to plant seeds of concern about Pinnacle's corporate governance without revealing my personal motivations. To Margaret Hamilton, president of the Rosehaven Chamber of Commerce, I've been hearing rumors about leadership changes at Pinnacle Financial. As someone who works with several of their institutional clients, I'm concerned about stability during transition periods. To Robert Chen, Dr. Chen's brother, who served on several nonprofit boards where Pinnacle provided financial services, have you noticed any changes in service quality or communication from Pinnacle recently? Some of my consulting clients have expressed concerns about account management transitions. To Sandra Williams, a financial journalist who covered regional business news, I'm working on a research project about succession planning in family-founded financial services firms. Pinnacle Financial might be an interesting case study, given the founder's age and recent strategic initiatives. Each conversation was brief, professional, and designed to create awareness without direct accusations. But together, they established a network of influential observers who would be paying attention to any unusual developments at Pinnacle Financial Holdings. The final element of my strategic execution was the most audacious. I decided to attend Harold's upcoming presentation to the Rosehaven Business Council, where he was scheduled to discuss strategic planning for regional financial services growth. Harold had no idea I planned to attend. The Business Council meetings were typically closed to spouses, but Dr. Chen had arranged for me to attend as her guest, introducing me as a consulting colleague interested in regional business development trends. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Dr. Chen asked when I outlined my plan. "If Harold sees you there, it might tip him off that you're more involved than he realizes." "That's exactly what I want," I replied. "Harold needs to understand that his assumptions about my capabilities and connections have been dangerously inaccurate." As I prepared for what would become Harold's last public presentation as the unchallenged leader of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: the thrill of intellectual challenge and strategic competition. For 40 years, I had channeled my business acumen into supporting Harold's success. Now, finally, I was using those same skills in direct opposition to the man who had spent decades underestimating me. Harold thought he was planning a corporate restructuring that would secure his future with Victoria Sterling. What he was actually doing was walking into the most sophisticated trap I had ever constructed, using skills he had forgotten I possessed and resources he never knew I had accumulated. The student was about to school the teacher, and the lesson was going to be unforgettable. Harold's presentation to the Rosehaven Business Council on October 15, 2018, was supposed to be his moment of triumph, a public showcase of his vision for Pinnacle Financial's future and his emergence as a regional industry leader. Instead, it became the moment he unknowingly activated the trap I had spent weeks preparing. The meeting was held at the Grandview Country Club's elegant Rosewood Room, where 60 of the region's most influential business leaders had gathered for their monthly luncheon. Harold had been anticipating this presentation for months, viewing it as the perfect platform to begin introducing his new strategic direction and, subtly, his new business partnership with Victoria Sterling. I arrived early with Dr. Rebecca Chen, who introduced me to several attendees as Margaret Ashford, one of our region's most insightful strategic consultants. The irony of using my maiden name at a meeting where my husband would be speaking wasn't lost on me, but Harold's habit of dismissing my professional activities meant he had never connected my consulting work with my identity. As business leaders filled the room, I positioned myself at a table near the back with a clear view of the podium, but far enough away that Harold wouldn't immediately notice me. Dr. Chen sat beside me, along with Robert Chen and 2 other university colleagues who understood they were witnessing something significant, though they didn't know exactly what. Harold entered the room 20 minutes before his scheduled presentation, accompanied by Victoria Sterling. This was the first time Victoria had attended a business council meeting, and Harold was clearly proud to introduce her to the assembled business leaders. She wore a sharp navy suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to be crowned as Rosehaven's next business royalty. "I'd like you all to meet Victoria Sterling," Harold announced during the networking portion of the luncheon. "Victoria has been instrumental in helping Pinnacle develop new strategic initiatives, and I'm confident you'll be hearing much more from her in the months ahead." Victoria smiled graciously and launched into a polished introduction that hit all the right notes. Her experience in marketing strategy, her passion for regional economic development, and her excitement about collaborating with established business leaders like Harold to drive innovation in traditional industries. I watched several attendees nod approvingly. Victoria was impressive, articulate, and clearly knowledgeable about business strategy. Under different circumstances, I might have admired her competence and ambition. Under these circumstances, I was studying her performance for weaknesses I could exploit. The formal presentation began after lunch, with Harold taking the podium to discuss strategic evolution in regional financial services. He looked confident and distinguished, every inch the successful entrepreneur who had built a thriving company through vision and determination. Harold's presentation was masterful, I had to admit. He outlined Pinnacle's growth trajectory, discussed emerging opportunities in wealth management and digital financial services, and painted a compelling picture of the company's future potential. His slides were professional, his delivery polished, and his strategic analysis genuinely insightful. But as Harold spoke, I noticed something that apparently escaped most of the audience. He was systematically rewriting Pinnacle's history in real time. "When I founded Pinnacle Financial Holdings in 1983, he said, clicking to a slide showing the company's timeline, "my vision was to create a different kind of financial services firm, one that combined sophisticated investment strategies with personalized service for regional clients." The slide showed Harold's photo alongside the founding date, with no mention of co-founders or initial investors. The narrative he presented was of a solo entrepreneur who had built success through individual brilliance and determination. Harold continued his historical revision throughout the presentation. "The early years required tremendous personal sacrifice," he said, showing photos of Pinnacle's first small office. "I worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, building client relationships and developing the investment strategies that became our foundation." Again, no mention of partners, co-founders, or anyone else's contributions to those early strategies. The most audacious moment came when Harold discussed Pinnacle's expansion into comprehensive wealth management services. This growth required not just capital investment, but strategic vision that could anticipate market trends years in advance, he said. "It's the kind of long-term thinking that separates successful entrepreneurs from those who simply react to immediate opportunities." Almost laughed at the irony. Harold was praising exactly the kind of strategic thinking I had been demonstrating for the past 6 years, while he remained completely oblivious to my activities. As Harold's presentation continued, I noticed Victoria Sterling taking notes from her seat in the front row. Occasionally, she would make subtle gestures, a nod, a smile, or a brief note passed to Harold during breaks between sections, that suggested she was actively involved in the presentation's content and strategy. This was clearly a performance they had rehearsed together, designed to establish Victoria's role as Harold's strategic partner and to position both of them for the next phase of their business relationship. Harold concluded his formal presentation with a section titled Future Leadership and Innovation, where he discussed the importance of bringing fresh perspectives and modern expertise to traditional financial services firms. Success in today's market requires leaders who understand both timeless investment principles and emerging technological opportunities, he said, glancing meaningfully at Victoria. Pinnacle's future will be built on combining proven experience with innovative thinking. The applause was enthusiastic, and several attendees approached Harold afterward to congratulate him on an impressive presentation. Victoria moved smoothly through the crowd, building on Harold's introduction with personalized conversations that demonstrated her knowledge of each person's business interests and potential synergies with Pinnacle's services. It was a flawless performance that would have secured Harold's reputation as a visionary leader and established Victoria as his worthy successor, if not for the question and answer session that followed. Margaret Hamilton, president of the Chamber of Commerce, raised her hand first. Harold, your presentation focused on Pinnacle's future direction, but I'm curious about the company's governance structure during this transition period. How are you ensuring continuity of fiduciary responsibility to existing clients while implementing new strategic initiatives? Harold looked slightly surprised by the question's technical specificity, but answered smoothly. Pinnacle's governance structure has remained consistent throughout our growth. As founder and CEO, I maintain direct oversight of all strategic decisions, with input from our senior staff and board of advisors. Robert Chen raised his hand next. I've heard some discussion in nonprofit circles about changes in service delivery from Pinnacle. Are you planning significant modifications to your client management structure? This question clearly caught Harold off guard. He glanced at Victoria before responding. We're always evaluating ways to improve client service, but any changes would be implemented gradually and with full client notification. The questions continued, each one slightly more pointed than the last. Sandra Williams, the financial journalist, asked about succession planning for family-founded firms. Dr. Rebecca Chen inquired about industry best practices for corporate governance during leadership transitions. Each question was professionally phrased and seemingly innocuous, but together they created a pattern that was making Harold visibly uncomfortable. Finally, Margaret Hamilton asked the question I had been hoping to hear. Harold, given the importance of transparency in financial services, would you be willing to share more details about Pinnacle's original founding structure and current ownership? Several of us work with firms that have evolved from family businesses, and we're always interested in successful governance models. Harold's confident smile faltered for the first time during the entire presentation. Pinnacle's ownership structure is, well, it's fairly straightforward. As the founder, I hold controlling interest, with some minority positions held by long-term investors and community stakeholders. And the original co-founding partners? Margaret Hamilton pressed gently. Were there others involved in the initial establishment? Harold's pause lasted several seconds too long. There were some early contributors who provided support during the startup phase, but the operational leadership has always been centralized. Victoria Sterling stepped forward at this moment, clearly trying to help Harold navigate the increasingly uncomfortable questions. Perhaps we could discuss specific governance details in a smaller setting, she suggested smoothly. Harold and I would be happy to arrange individual consultations with anyone interested in learning more about Pinnacle's strategic evolution. It was a graceful attempt to redirect the conversation, but it also confirmed what several people in the room were beginning to suspect. Harold's presentation had raised more questions than it had answered. As the formal meeting concluded, and attendees began to leave, I remained seated, watching Harold and Victoria huddle in intense conversation near the podium. Harold looked frustrated and confused by the unexpected scrutiny his presentation had received. Victoria appeared to be reassuring him, but I could see tension in her posture that suggested she was also concerned about the afternoon's developments. Dr. Chen leaned over and whispered, "That was masterfully orchestrated. Harold has no idea what just happened, does he?" "Not yet," I replied quietly. "But he's about to find out." As Harold packed up his presentation materials, he finally noticed me sitting across the room. His expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something approaching alarm as he realized his wife had witnessed his entire performance, including his systematic erasure of her contributions to Pinnacle's history. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. Harold's expression was uncertain, almost questioning, as if he was trying to determine whether my presence had been coincidental or intentional. I smiled and gave him a small wave, the same gesture I might have used at any social function over the past 40 years. Then I stood, gathered my purse, and walked out of the room without speaking to him. Harold thought he had delivered a triumphant presentation that established his vision for Pinnacle's future. What he had actually done was provide me with the perfect public forum to demonstrate that his version of history could be questioned, his leadership could be scrutinized, and his assumptions about controlling the narrative were dangerously flawed. The trap had been activated. Now it was time to spring it. The 35th anniversary celebration I had been planning for months took place on Saturday evening, October 27, 2018, in the grand ballroom of the historic Rosehaven Inn. Harold thought he was attending a farewell party where he would graciously thank me for decades of support before transitioning to his new life with Victoria Sterling. Instead, he was walking into the most public revelation of his career and the most devastating miscalculation of his life. 85 guests filled the elegantly decorated ballroom, representing 4 decades of our social and professional relationships. I had carefully curated the guest list to include not just family and close friends, but every significant figure from Rosehaven's business community, several clients and former clients of Pinnacle Financial, and a selection of regional financial industry leaders who would understand the implications of what they were about to witness. Harold arrived fashionably late, as was his custom at social events, wearing his best charcoal suit and the confident smile of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of the evening ahead. Victoria Sterling was not with him. I had specifically excluded her from the guest list, explaining to Harold that our anniversary celebration should focus on family and long-standing friendships. Harold had accepted this reasoning without argument, apparently viewing the evening as a formality to be endured before moving forward with his real life. The first hour proceeded exactly as Harold expected. Guests mingled over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, sharing memories of our family milestones and Harold's business achievements. Several longtime friends offered toasts to our enduring marriage and Harold's remarkable success in building Pinnacle Financial from modest beginnings into a regional powerhouse. Harold basked in the familiar rhythm of praise and recognition, working the room with practiced ease, accepting congratulations on both our marriage and his business accomplishments. He seemed relaxed and genuinely happy for the first time in months, perhaps because he believed this celebration represented closure on one chapter of his life before opening another. I moved through the crowd with equal grace, playing the role of grateful wife and gracious hostess that I had perfected over decades of corporate social functions. But unlike previous events, tonight I was also monitoring the positioning of key guests, ensuring that the most important witnesses were optimally located for what was coming. Dr. Rebecca Chen had strategically seated herself near the front of the room, along with several colleagues from Grandview University's business school. Margaret Hamilton from the Chamber of Commerce was positioned at a table with other community leaders. Sandra Williams, the financial journalist, had accepted my invitation and brought her photographer, ostensibly to cover a significant community social event. David Richardson from Meridian Capital Group sat at a table with several investment professionals who had driven down from the state capitol for the evening. Most importantly, Jonathan Webb, our family attorney, was present with his wife, carrying a leather portfolio that I knew contained documents that would reshape everyone's understanding of our family's history and Pinnacle Financial's true founding story. At 8 o'clock, I called for attention and invited Harold to join me at the front of the ballroom for the traditional anniversary speeches. Harold approached with obvious pleasure, clearly anticipating the opportunity to publicly acknowledge my contributions to his success before gracefully transitioning to his future plans. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, "Margaret and I are deeply moved by your presence here tonight. 35 years of marriage represents more than just personal commitment. It represents partnership, shared sacrifice, and mutual support through all of life's challenges and opportunities. The audience listened attentively as Harold delivered what sounded like a heartfelt tribute to our marriage and my role in his success. He spoke eloquently about the early years when we had worked together to build our dreams, about my sacrifices in putting family first while he pursued business, opportunities, and about the stable foundation I had provided that allowed him to take the professional risks that had ultimately paid off so handsomely. It was a beautiful speech that painted a picture of traditional marriage roles and complementary contributions. Harold presented himself as the ambitious entrepreneur and me as the devoted wife whose support had made his achievements possible. The audience responded warmly, clearly moved by this portrayal of enduring love and partnership. Margaret has been the foundation upon which everything else was built, Harold concluded, turning to smile at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. I couldn't have achieved any of this without her steady presence and unwavering support. Tonight is about celebrating not just our marriage, but the partnership that made our life together possible. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained. Several guests dabbed at their eyes, clearly touched by Harold's apparent sincerity and the romantic narrative of shared success he had presented. Then Harold did exactly what I had been counting on him to do. He extended the microphone toward me and said, "And now I'd love to hear from my partner in everything, Margaret." I accepted the microphone with the same gracious smile I had worn throughout the evening. But as I looked out at the assembled crowd, my expression shifted subtly. The demure anniversary wife was being replaced by someone these guests had never seen before. Margaret Ashford, co-founder of Pinnacle Financial Holdings and strategic investor with 40 years of experience in regional financial markets. "Thank you, Harold," I began, my voice carrying a new note of authority that caused several guests to lean forward attentively. "Your speech was beautifully delivered, and I'm sure everyone here was moved by your description of our partnership. I'd like to talk about that partnership in a bit more detail." I paused, noting the slight confusion that flickered across Harold's face. This wasn't the gracious, brief response he had expected. "Harold spoke about the early years when we worked together to build our dreams," I continued, "and I think it might interest our guests to know more about exactly what that partnership looked like in practical terms." I gestured to Jonathan Webb, who stood and approached the front of the room carrying his leather portfolio. Jonathan has been our family attorney for 15 years, but tonight he's here in a different capacity. Jonathan, would you please distribute the documents we discussed? As Jonathan began handing out packets of papers to specific guests throughout the room, Harold's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Margaret, what are you doing?" he whispered, leaning close to the microphone. "I'm telling the truth." "About our partnership," I replied, my voice now carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "Something that apparently needs clarification after your recent public presentations." I turned back to the audience, many of whom were now examining the documents Jonathan had distributed. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at the original incorporation documents for Pinnacle Financial Holdings, filed in March 1983. You'll notice that the company was founded by two people, Harold Blackwood and Margaret Ashford Blackwood, with equal partnership shares and complementary operational responsibilities. The room had grown completely silent except for the rustle of papers as guests examined the legal documents. You're also looking at bank records showing the initial capitalization of $35,000, which came from my family inheritance, not from Harold's savings or outside investors. And you'll find the original business plan for Pinnacle Financial Services, written entirely by me during the winter of 1982-1983, before Harold and I were even engaged. Harold grabbed my arm, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. "Margaret, this is not the time or place for—" "Actually, Harold," I interrupted, gently removing his hand from my arm, "this is exactly the time and place. You see, our guests include several people who attended your recent presentation to the Business Council, where you described yourself as Pinnacle's sole founder and credited the company's success to your individual vision and effort. I looked directly at Margaret Hamilton, who was studying the incorporation documents with obvious fascination. Margaret, you asked Harold about Pinnacle's original founding structure. I think these documents answer your question quite clearly. Dr. Rebecca Chen raised her hand from her table near the front. Margaret, are you saying that Harold has been misrepresenting Pinnacle's corporate history in public forums? I'm saying that Harold's version of our company's founding has evolved over the years to match his preferred narrative, rather than documented historical facts, I replied diplomatically, but pointedly. Sandra Williams, the financial journalist, was taking rapid notes while her photographer captured the scene. Mrs. Blackwood, what prompted you to make this information public tonight? I discovered that Harold is planning to restructure Pinnacle Financial Holdings in ways that would formalize the erasure of my co-founder status, I answered. Since Harold has chosen to conduct these plans in partnership with someone else, I felt it was important to clarify the actual legal and historical foundation of the company before any major changes are implemented. The implications of my statement weren't lost on the business leaders in the audience. David Richardson from Meridian Capital Group looked particularly interested, clearly recognizing that this revelation could significantly impact any potential acquisition discussions. Harold stood frozen beside me, apparently unable to process how completely his carefully constructed narrative had been dismantled in front of the most important professional and social contacts in his life. The confident, successful entrepreneur who had entered the ballroom an hour earlier had been replaced by a man whose fundamental credibility was suddenly in question. Harold, I said, turning to face him directly while still speaking into the microphone. Did you really think I would gracefully accept being written out of the story of the company I helped create? Did you imagine I would quietly disappear, while you and Victoria Sterling rewrote history to suit your future plans? The mention of Victoria's name sent a ripple of understanding through the crowd. Several guests exchanged glances, clearly connecting details they had noticed but not previously understood. Harold's response was barely audible. When did you? I've been paying attention, Harold, I replied. For 6 years, I've been paying very close attention, and tomorrow morning I'm going to show you exactly what that attention has accomplished. The anniversary celebration Harold had expected to be his graceful farewell had become the public exposure of 40 years of lies, the destruction of his carefully crafted reputation, and the first glimpse of a reckoning he never saw coming. The 72 hours following our anniversary party created a cascade of consequences that reached far beyond Harold's wounded ego or our destroyed marriage. By Monday morning, the carefully constructed world Harold had built around his version of success was crumbling from multiple directions simultaneously. The first shockwave hit at 6:30 a.m. when Harold's phone began ringing with calls from Pinnacle's major clients. Sandra Williams had filed her story for the Monday business section of the Rosehaven Herald, complete with photographs from the anniversary party and detailed quotes from my revelation about Pinnacle's true founding structure. The headline read, "Local financial firm's founding story disputed at anniversary celebration." Harold sat at our kitchen table in his robe, fielding increasingly uncomfortable calls while I prepared coffee with the same calm efficiency I had maintained for 4 decades of marriage. The difference was that now I was listening to his conversations with the analytical attention of someone who understood exactly what each call represented for Pinnacle's future stability. "Mr. Henderson, I understand your concerns," Harold said into his phone, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure. "The article misrepresents some historical details, but I assure you that Pinnacle's current operations and your account management remain completely unaffected." George Henderson, whose family trust represented nearly $15 million in managed assets, was apparently not reassured. I could hear his voice through the phone, though not his specific words, And Harold's increasingly defensive responses made it clear that Henderson was questioning not just the historical accuracy of Pinnacle's founding story, but Harold's current credibility as a fiduciary manager. The second call came from Patricia Morrison, president of the Rosehaven Community Foundation, whose endowment Pinnacle had managed for over a decade. This conversation was even more difficult for Harold, as Patricia had been present at the anniversary party and witnessed my revelation firsthand. "Patricia, please understand that this is a personal matter between Margaret and me that has unfortunately spilled over into public discussion," Harold pleaded. "My professional capabilities and the Foundation's investment performance have nothing to do with ancient history about company founding." But Patricia Morrison was a sophisticated investor who understood that corporate governance issues were never truly separate from fiduciary responsibility. Her questions, based on what I could hear of Harold's responses, focused on whether Pinnacle had properly disclosed its ownership structure to institutional clients, and whether Harold's authority to make investment decisions on behalf of the Foundation might be compromised by unresolved shareholder disputes. By 8 a.m., Harold had received 6 similar calls, each more challenging than the last. Pinnacle's clients weren't just concerned about historical accuracy. They were questioning whether Harold had the legal authority to manage their assets if his ownership and control of the company were disputed by a co-founder they had never been told about. The second shockwave arrived at 9:15 a.m. in the form of an official letter delivered by courier from the law offices of Sterling and Associates. Dr. Rebecca Chen's firm was representing me in my capacity as co-founder and original investor in Pinnacle Financial Holdings, demanding immediate access to corporate records, financial statements, and board meeting minutes for the past 5 years. Harold read the letter twice before looking up at me with an expression that combined fury, disbelief, and the dawning realization that Saturday night's revelation had been only the beginning of his problems. "Margaret, what is this?" he demanded, waving. "The legal document." "You're actually suing the company?" "I'm exercising my rights as co-founder to review corporate governance and financial management," I replied calmly, buttering my toast. The letter explains everything quite clearly. The legal demand was comprehensive and professionally devastating. Dr. Chen's letter outlined my co-founder status, my original investment, and my legal right to examine Pinnacle's corporate records. More importantly, it raised specific questions about potential governance violations, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and possible breach of fiduciary duty in Harold's management of shareholder assets. The letter also requested immediate clarification of Harold's authority to enter into strategic partnerships, restructure company ownership, or make major operational changes without proper co-founder notification and approval. Harold's face went pale as he absorbed the implications. "This could destroy everything," he whispered. "If clients think there's internal legal conflict about company ownership and management authority, they'll start pulling their accounts." "Yes," I agreed. "They probably will." The third shockwave came at 10:30 a.m. when Victoria Sterling arrived at our house, her professional composure cracked by panic and fury. She had obviously seen the newspaper article and understood that her carefully planned future as Harold's business partner was suddenly in serious jeopardy. "Harold, we need to talk immediately," she announced, barely acknowledging my presence. "My attorney says this situation could have serious implications for the strategic partnership we've been developing." I watched from the kitchen doorway as Victoria and Harold huddled in intense conversation in our living room. Victoria's voice was tight with controlled anger as she outlined the potential damage to her own reputation and business interests. "I've spent months building relationships with Pinnacle's key clients based on the understanding that you had clear, undisputed authority to make strategic decisions," she hissed. "If your wife can challenge your corporate authority, then every agreement we've discussed could be legally questionable." Harold tried to reassure her, but his arguments sounded hollow even to me. He insisted that my claims were emotional rather than legal. that any competent attorney could establish his clear authority based on decades of operational control, and that the situation would be resolved quickly once emotions cooled. Victoria wasn't convinced. "Harold, I've already had 3 clients call this morning asking about the newspaper article. They're not concerned about your feelings. They're concerned about legal liability and fiduciary responsibility. If this woman can claim co-founder status and challenge your decisions, then my association with Pinnacle could damage my own professional credibility." The 4th shockwave arrived at noon in the form of a phone call from David Richardson at Meridian Capital Group. Harold took the call in his study, but I could hear his voice rising with stress and frustration as the conversation progressed. From what I could gather from Harold's responses, Meridian was suspending their acquisition discussions pending resolution of the ownership and governance issues I had raised. David Richardson was apparently very concerned about the legal complexities my co-founder claims might create for any potential purchase of Pinnacle. "David, please understand that this is a temporary family dispute that has no bearing on Pinnacle's operational value or acquisition potential," Harold pleaded. "Margaret is simply upset about our divorce, and she's using these old documents to create leverage in our personal settlement." But David Richardson was a sophisticated investor who understood that family business disputes were often the most complex and expensive to resolve. Meridian couldn't risk a major acquisition that might be complicated by unresolved co-founder claims, especially when those claims appeared to be supported by original legal documents. The 5th shockwave was the most devastating. By 2 p.m., Harold I had received resignation letters from 3 of Pinnacle's senior staff members. The departing employees cited uncertainty about corporate governance and leadership structure as their primary reason for seeking positions elsewhere. These weren't junior employees who could be easily replaced. Margaret Foster, Pinnacle's senior portfolio manager, had been with the company for 12 years and managed relationships with several major institutional clients. David Park, the chief financial officer, controlled Pinnacle's internal financial systems and regulatory compliance. Susan Chen, the director of client services, was responsible for day-to-day communication with over 200 individual and family accounts. Their simultaneous departure would create immediate operational problems for Pinnacle, but more importantly, it would signal to clients and competitors that the company's internal stability was seriously compromised. Harold spent the afternoon making increasingly desperate phone calls, trying to convince departing employees to reconsider, reassuring worried clients about operational continuity, and attempting to develop legal strategies for containing the damage from my co-founder claims. Victoria Sterling left at 4 p.m., informing Harold that she was reassessing her strategic options, given the unexpected complications in Pinnacle's corporate structure. Her departure was polite but final. She had no intention of tying her professional future to a company whose ownership and management authority were suddenly in legal dispute. By evening, Harold was sitting alone in his study, surrounded by legal documents, client files, and resignation letters. The confident, successful entrepreneur who had planned to gracefully transition from one life chapter to another had been replaced by a man whose professional reputation, business relationships, and personal future were all simultaneously in crisis. I knocked gently on his study door at 8 p.m., carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same concerned expression I had used during previous business crises throughout our marriage. "Harold," I said softly, "I think we need to talk about how to resolve this situation." He looked up at me with exhausted eyes, clearly broken by the day's accumulating disasters. "Margaret, what do you want? What will it take to make this stop?" I sat down across from his desk, the same seat I had occupied decades earlier when we used to discuss business strategy as genuine partners. "I want what I've always wanted, Harold," I said quietly. "I want recognition for my actual contributions to our company's success. I want respect for my intelligence and capabilities. And I want you to understand that partnership means equality, not one person taking credit while the other provides support. Harold stared at me, finally beginning to comprehend that the woman he had dismissed as a supportive housewife had orchestrated the complete dismantling of his carefully constructed world in less than 72 hours. "You planned all of this," he whispered. "The anniversary party, the legal demands, even the staff resignations. You've been planning this for years." 6 years, I confirmed. "Ever since I realized our marriage wasn't going through rough patches, it was fundamentally broken, and you had no intention of fixing it." The ripple effects were still spreading, and Harold was finally beginning to understand that his story wasn't ending the way he had written it. 3 months after our anniversary party revelation, I stood in the boardroom of the newly restructured Pinnacle Financial Holdings, addressing the assembled staff as the company's officially recognized co-founder and newly appointed chief strategic officer. The transformation had been as complete as it was inevitable. Harold's world had been rebuilt according to the truth rather than his preferred fiction. The interim period had been brutal for Harold, but surprisingly liberating for me. As word spread through Rosehaven's business community about the real founding story of Pinnacle Financial, I discovered that my professional reputation had been waiting patiently for decades, ready to emerge once the historical record was corrected. The legal resolution came faster than anyone expected. Harold's attorneys quickly realized that my documentation was ironclad, and that fighting my co-founder claims would be both expensive and futile. More importantly, they understood that Harold's professional survival depended on accepting my terms, rather than prolonging a dispute that was destroying what remained of his credibility. The settlement we reached in early December 2018 was comprehensive, and, for me, deeply satisfying. Harold retained his position as CEO of Pinnacle Financial Holdings, but with clearly defined limitations on his authority. All major strategic decisions now required co-founder approval. Corporate governance would be overseen by an independent board of directors that included several respected financial professionals from the regional business community. Most importantly, Pinnacle's official history was corrected to acknowledge my role as co-founder, original investor, and strategic architect of the company's early success. Harold's relationship with Victoria Sterling had predictably crumbled under the pressure of our corporate restructuring. Once it became clear that Harold's authority was limited and his reputation was damaged, Victoria had quickly found other business opportunities that didn't involve association with publicly discredited leadership. Harold never mentioned her again after December, though I occasionally saw references to her work with other firms in the regional business press. The impact on our children was more complex and emotionally challenging than the business resolution. Elizabeth, Thomas, and Sarah had all been shocked by the public revelation of family secrets they had never suspected. Their initial reaction was protective of Harold, whom they viewed as the victim of my calculated revenge. But as the legal proceedings revealed the depth of historical documentation supporting my claims, all three gradually began questioning the family narrative they had accepted without examination for their entire adult lives. Elizabeth, the corporate lawyer, was the first to understand the legal implications. "Mother," she told me during a difficult phone conversation in late November, "I've reviewed all the documents your attorney provided. Dad's version of Pinnacle's founding isn't just inaccurate, it's legally problematic from a corporate governance standpoint." Thomas took longer to process the revelation, particularly as it related to his own assumptions about business success and family roles. "I always thought Dad was this brilliant entrepreneur who built everything from nothing," he admitted during a visit to Rosehaven in January. "It never occurred to me to question why you seemed so smart about business matters if you'd never been involved in the actual work." Sarah's response was perhaps the most thoughtful. During a long phone conversation from her home in Ocean View, she said, "Mom, I think I owe you an apology. I've spent my entire adult life assuming you were satisfied with traditional family roles because that's what Dad taught us to believe. I never considered that you might have given up things you wanted in order to support his ambitions." The reconciliation with my children wasn't immediate or complete, but it was genuine. They began visiting more frequently, asking questions about the early years of our marriage and Pinnacle's development that they had never thought to ask before. Gradually, they started seeing me not just as their father's wife, but as an independent person with her own intelligence, ambitions, and accomplishments. The professional transformation was equally rewarding. As Pinnacle's recognized co-founder and chief strategic officer, I finally had the platform to implement ideas I had been developing for decades. My first major initiative was expanding our services to include comprehensive financial education programs for women and minorities, populations that had been underserved by traditional financial advisory firms. The Ashford Initiative, named after my maiden name to distinguish it from Harold's traditional approach, focused on helping clients build long-term wealth through education rather than dependence on advisor expertise. The program attracted significant positive attention from both clients and industry professionals, establishing Pinnacle as an innovative leader in accessible financial services. Working with Harold in our new corporate structure required careful navigation of personal and professional boundaries. We developed a formal communication protocol that allowed us to collaborate effectively while maintaining emotional distance. Harold, chastened by the near collapse of everything he had built, proved surprisingly willing to defer to my strategic judgment on complex business matters. Our personal relationship settled into a pattern of polite coexistence. We never divorced. The legal and financial complications of separating our intertwined lives seemed more trouble than simply maintaining separate social lives within the same household. Harold moved into the guest suite of our Rosewood Hill home, while I claimed the master bedroom and his former study as my new home office. The arrangement worked better than either of us expected. Harold focused on client relationships and day-to-day operations, areas where his natural talents were genuinely valuable. I concentrated on strategic planning, business development, and the financial education initiatives that had become my passion. We attended business functions together when necessary, presenting a united professional front while maintaining private emotional independence. 6 months after our anniversary revelation, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rebecca Chen. "Margaret," she said, "I've been contacted by the Grandview Business School about a very interesting opportunity. They're looking for a guest lecturer to teach a course on entrepreneurship and family business dynamics." The teaching opportunity led to others. By the fall of 2019, I was regularly speaking at professional conferences about women's roles in business development, the challenges of family business succession, and the importance of accurate corporate governance. My story had become a case study in several business school programs, though always presented with appropriate privacy protections for our family. The most satisfying professional recognition came in March 2020, when the Regional Financial Services Association honored me with their Outstanding Contribution Award for my work in financial education and business ethics. Harold attended the ceremony and applauded politely when I received the award, but I could see in his eyes that he finally understood what he had lost by dismissing my capabilities for so many years. The personal transformation was deeper and more lasting than the professional recognition. At 73, I had reclaimed not just my business identity, but my sense of agency and self-worth. The woman who had spent decades enabling someone else's success had become someone who created her own achievements and received direct credit for her contributions. Looking back now, I can see that Harold's decision to hand me divorce papers on our anniversary was actually a gift, though not the kind he intended. His betrayal forced me to acknowledge truths I had been avoiding about our marriage and my own capabilities. His attempt to erase me from Pinnacle's history motivated me to document and reclaim my actual contributions. His assumption that I would accept graceful invisibility prompted me to demand recognition and respect. Harold thought he was writing the final chapter of our marriage and starting a new story with Victoria Sterling. Instead, he provided me with the motivation to write my own story, one where I was the protagonist rather than the supporting character. The most profound change wasn't in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. For 40 years, I had measured my worth through Harold's success and my family's stability. Now, I measured my worth through my own accomplishments, my contributions to my clients' success, and the satisfaction of work that aligned with my values and utilized my talents. Harold learned, too late to save our marriage, but perhaps in time to save his remaining professional relationships, that partnership requires genuine respect for both parties' contributions. The man who had taken credit for shared achievements while dismissing his partner's capabilities discovered that success built on false premises is ultimately unsustainable. At 73, I finally understood that the most important story we tell is the one we tell ourselves about our own value and potential. Harold had convinced me to accept a story where I was a supporting character in his narrative. When I finally wrote my own story, I discovered I had always been capable of being the hero. The divorce papers Harold handed me on our anniversary were supposed to represent the end of my relevance to his life. Instead, they marked the beginning of my recognition of my own power, intelligence, and worth. Harold thought he was discarding a used-up wife. Instead, he awakened a formidable business partner who had been sleeping for far too long. Some stories end with revenge. This one ends with reclamation of truth, respect, recognition, and ultimately, of myself. 5 years have passed since that October evening when Harold handed me divorce papers and yellow carnations, thinking he was orchestrating the end of my story. As I write this, sitting in my private office at Pinnacle Financial Holdings, the office that now bears a nameplate reading Margaret Blackwood, co-founder and chief strategic officer, I'm struck by how completely wrong we can be about the chapters of our lives. Today marks a milestone I never could have imagined during those decades when I measured my worth through Harold's achievements. Forbes magazine has included me in their annual feature on women who transformed regional business. The article, titled The Late Bloomer, How Margaret Blackwood Rewrote the Rules at 71, will be published next month, featuring a photograph of me in my corner office overlooking Lake Serenity, surrounded by the awards and recognition I've accumulated. Over the past 5 years, the interviewer, a sharp young woman named Jessica Chen, Dr. Rebecca Chen's daughter as it happens, asked me the question everyone seems curious about. Mrs. Blackwood, do you ever regret not asserting yourself earlier? Do you wonder what might have happened if you'd claimed your rightful place at Pinnacle decades ago? It's a fair question, and one I've thought about often. The honest answer is complicated. I don't regret the years I spent building a family and supporting Harold's public success, because those years gave me Elizabeth, Thomas, and Sarah, who have all grown into remarkable adults with their own stories to tell. Elizabeth now runs her own law firm specializing in corporate governance and women's business rights. Thomas has started a sustainable investment fund that specifically focuses on companies with strong diversity leadership. Sarah returned from Ocean View last year and now directs our financial education programs from our new Portland office. What I regret is allowing Harold's narrative to become my truth for so long. I regret accepting his definition of partnership and his assessment of my capabilities. Most of all, I regret the years I spent making myself smaller to accommodate his need to be the sole architect of our shared success. But those regrets have been transformed into something more powerful: determination to ensure that other women don't make the same mistake. The Ashford Initiative has expanded beyond Pinnacle to become a regional program offered through partnerships with universities, community colleges, and nonprofit organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. We've served over 2,000 women in the past 3 years, providing financial education, business mentoring, and entrepreneurship support, specifically designed for women who are starting their professional lives later or rebuilding their careers after family obligations. The program's success has attracted national attention. Next month, I'll be speaking at the National Women's Financial Empowerment Conference in Chicago. sharing the platform with executives from major financial institutions and government agencies. The girl who was once content to manage household finances while Harold handled real business will be addressing an audience of 1,500 financial professionals about innovative approaches to wealth building for underserved populations. Harold. And I have settled into a relationship that works better than either of us expected. We're business partners first, housemates second, and former spouses third. He handles client relationships and regulatory compliance, areas where his experience and natural abilities serve Pinnacle well. I focus on strategic development, educational programs, and the industry leadership that has become my passion. We attend board meetings together, present a united front at business functions, and maintain separate social lives without drama or conflict. The arrangement has allowed both of us to play to our strengths while avoiding the personal dynamics that made our marriage unsustainable. Harold has become a competent operational leader, while I've emerged as the visionary strategist whose ideas drive Pinnacle's continued growth and innovation. Our personal relationship will never be what it was in those early years when we genuinely believed we were building something together as equals. Too much has happened, too many deceptions have been revealed, and too many years of dismissal can't be completely forgotten. But we've found a way to be productive colleagues and respectful co-parents, which is more than many divorced couples achieve. The most surprising development has been Harold's gradual acknowledgement of what he lost through his decades of underestimating me. Last month, during our quarterly strategy meeting, he listened to my presentation on expanding Pinnacle's services to include retirement planning for women entrepreneurs, then said quietly, "Margaret, I wish I had been smart enough to see your capabilities when we were young. Pinnacle could have been twice as successful if I had treated you as an equal partner from the beginning." It was the closest thing to an apology I'll ever receive from Harold, and frankly, it was enough. I'm not interested in relitigating 40 years of marriage. I'm interested in making the most of whatever years remain to me. At 76, I'm busier and more professionally fulfilled than I've ever been. My calendar is filled with speaking engagements, consulting projects, board meetings, and strategic planning sessions. I travel regularly for business, something I rarely did during my years as Harold's supportive wife. I've published articles in financial journals, been quoted as an expert source in national business publications, and developed professional relationships with colleagues across the country who value my insights and expertise. The personal satisfaction goes beyond professional recognition. I wake up each morning knowing that the day ahead will be filled with work that matters to me, challenges that engage my intelligence, and interactions with people who see me as Margaret Blackwood rather than Harold's wife. The woman who once felt invisible has become someone whose opinion is sought, whose expertise is respected, and whose contributions are directly credited to her own capabilities. My relationship with my children has deepened in ways I never expected. They've watched their mother transform from a background figure into a prominent business leader, and that transformation has changed how they see their own possibilities. Elizabeth credits my example with inspiring her to start her own firm rather than remaining a junior partner in someone else's practice. Thomas says, watching me reclaim my professional identity helped him understand the importance of authentic partnership in his own marriage. Sarah has found her calling in our financial education work, discovering talents she didn't know she possessed. The grandchildren, Elizabeth's twin daughters and Thomas's son, know me as Grandma Margaret, who runs the company with Grandpa Harold. They've never known me as anything other than a successful businesswoman, which gives me hope that they'll grow up expecting equality and partnership as natural parts of their own relationships. Looking back at that October evening 5 years ago, I can see now that Harold's decision to hand me divorce papers was the catalyst I needed, but had been too comfortable to seek on my own. His betrayal forced me to stop accepting his version of our shared history and start documenting the truth. His attempt to erase me from Pinnacle's founding story motivated me to reclaim not just historical accuracy, but ongoing relevance and authority. Harold thought he was discarding a used-up wife who had served her purpose in his success story. Instead, he awakened a formidable business leader who had been dormant for decades, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The most profound lesson of these 5 years is that it's never too late to reclaim your story. At 71, I thought my productive years were behind me. At 76, I'm pioneering programs that will outlast me, building professional relationships that energize me, and contributing to conversations that shape industry standards. Harold's divorce papers were supposed to represent the end of my relevance to his life and the conclusion of my story as his partner. Instead, they marked the beginning of my recognition that I had always been the author of my own narrative. I had just been letting someone else hold the pen for far too long. Some stories end with the protagonist getting revenge on those who wronged them. Other stories end with the protagonist discovering they were stronger than they ever imagined. My story ends with something more powerful than either revenge or self-discovery. It ends with transformation, contribution, and the knowledge that the most important chapters of my life were written not in my youth, but in the wisdom of my later years. The woman who accepted divorce papers with quiet dignity while secretly planning her response has become someone who doesn't need to plan responses anymore. I've become someone who initiates rather than reacts, who creates rather than supports, and who leads rather than follows. Harold gave me those papers thinking he was ending our story. Instead, he gave me permission to begin the story I was always meant to write, one where I was never the supporting character, but always the hero of my own remarkable life. At 76, I'm just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.